Welcome to the X-Perts, your obsessional guides to all things X-Men. I am Jeremy.
I'm Joanna.
And I am Jesse.
For more of the latest headlines and entertainment, please go to our website at wearesecondunion.com. You know what? This show is going to be a little different from the last few, because the last few we've discussed basic X-Men concepts and individual characters. This is the first time we're going to be talking about an X-Men storyline. And I chose the Mutant Massacre simply because I had never read it before, so it feels like the kind of thing where I should have more information about. And it also felt like something that you guys just weren't generally aware of the details of.
Yeah, a lot of them were surprised.
More than a bit, yeah. When I did my research, I was not surprised to find out that it was an X-Men crossover, but what I am surprised to find out about is that it is and is not an X-Men crossover.
Explain?
Okay, so this happened in 4 different series, technically. Actually, 5. No, sorry. This actually happened in 6 different series, believe it or not. The
Wow.
X-Men, X-Factor, Power Pack, the New Mutants, the Mighty Thor, and Daredevil.
Okay.
And when I say it's a crossover and it's not a crossover, what I mean is the Mutant Massacre impacts all these series. Except, for the most part, the characters of the various series didn't interact with each other. In other words, there were aspects of the storyline that, say, something collapsed in one of the X-Men series. Well, X-Factor ended up wandering through the tunnel in their series. Then they found a collapsed tunnel, but had no context as to how it happened. Then, say X-Factor got into a fight with the Marauders, and Cyclops let loose one of his eye blasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a later issue of, I believe it was either X-Men or the New Mutants, while they're wandering through the tunnels, suddenly they dodge his power blast, which looks really familiar, but they don't have time to think about it.
Huh.
This is the way the whole thing went. A lot of the writing was done by Chris Claremont and Walt Simonson in the X-Men series. And Simonson had a couple funny quotes about it. Quote, "Partly what we were trying to do in the crossover was not create a string of beads where you had to go from one bead to the next bead to the next bead in order to follow the entire storyline. What we were trying to do, rather, was take several separate skeins and intertwine them in such a way that they formed a coherent whole, but then unwound and went in their own directions. And you can follow any one skein through the Massacre. You can read X-Men, you can read X-Factor, or you can read Thor, New Mutants, Power Pack, or Daredevil without having to go over and read all of the other books. But of course, then you don't get the whole picture," unquote. So what you have essentially is 6 stories around the same event that could be entirely self-contained, and you don't need to read the others to understand the particular parts of your favorite characters, or you could actually read the entirety of it and then understand the scope of the Massacre on a whole. It's a really complex and kind of intriguing way to go about it. I mean, you guys are probably used to the same kind of events I am. You follow one story to the next story to the next story. You don't generally get to pick and choose like this.
Mm-hmm.
Simonson was also asked what it was like to coordinate all the Mutant Massacre linked stories, and his exact response was, quote, "It was horrible. I don't know why we're thinking of doing this again," unquote. And I don't quite know what he meant by again. He gave that interview to Fictioneer Books. But there was actually some heavyweight creators that were involved in this. Chris Claremont, Louise Simonson, and Walter Simonson wrote. The pencilers were John Romita Jr., Walt Simonson, and Sal Buscema. And the inkers were Dan Green, Bob Wiasek, and Sal Buscema. I actually know most of those names, which kind of frightens me. But because I didn't want to overburden you guys with a whole lot of reading, I did not make anyone read the Mutant Massacre. I did not have time to read it all, but I at least flipped through most of it, and I read over half of it before I ran out of time. Surprisingly, I actually have an issue of this in my own personal collection. And when I say I have an issue, I have the very first issue of X-Men that involves this storyline, but that's all I have in my collection. I didn't even know that's what I read back in the day. This picks up right after the X-Men had a peculiar adventure. Nightcrawler ended up very hurt, and while he's physically okay, his powers are creating a very big strain on his body. He can't use them rapid fire like he does in a lot of other stories. And Phoenix, and when I say Phoenix, I mean Rachel Gray, has just vanished. Wolverine followed her after she tried to kill members of the Hellfire Club, and her trail ran cold at one point, and he just has no other way to follow her. Meanwhile, Professor X is gone, and I don't know entirely where he is at this point, but the Xavier School is being run by Magneto. This was a period where everyone thought Moira used a device on Magneto to change his alignment. He went from an evil mutant to a good one, but of course he used to be a mutant terrorist, so nobody would listen to him.
Naturally.
Except, now that his alignment was changed, Xavier left him in charge of the New Mutants. The X-Men were allowed to run themselves, but they consulted with Magneto on a pretty regular basis. Rogue is in probably her third outfit at this point, and this one she just kind of got because her prior one was ruined in the previous fight, as well as her face getting dirty, and this is when she's using Miss Marvel's powers as a base.
Okay, gotcha.
So she's flying around, nigh invulnerable. No energy abilities. This was before Carol Danvers started to really develop those powers.
Gotcha.
And Illyana is a teenager at this point. She's a member of the New Mutants in decent standing. She's already been through her Limbo adventures. Kitty Pryde is primarily working on the technology and still the youngest X-Man on the roster. They do have Lockheed by this point. And the X-Men are aware of something called X-Factor investigations, however they do not know that is entirely populated by the original 5 X-Men.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
The teams early on, I don't quite know the right way to put it. When Jean Grey was found to be resurrected, the original X-Men rallied around her. But for some reason they, well, actually we discussed this. Camera Hodge manipulated Warren into disguising their new superhero group as mutant hunters because it would allow them, supposedly, to find mutants more easily if they could move freely throughout the populace. What they didn't know was that Hodge manipulated them into making it look like mutant hunting is a viable business. So, you understand the problem there.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the massacre started with the Morlocks invading the tunnels, and X-Factor had its own problems at the very beginning that didn't have to do with the same problems the X-Men were having. Primarily, they were dealing with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who at this time are a government-known agency known as Freedom Force. This was part of their thing. The government was giving them a pass on all their past crimes as long as they did government enforcement on mutant issues.
Every time I hear that name, though, it reminds me of the Evil League of Evil.
No, it's fine. Freedom Force was one of those things I think was purposefully badly branded by comics writers just to let you know it's like they're barely here, you know?
Well, I mean, the previous group name.
Oh, the Brotherhood.
The Brotherhood of Mutants. It's like,
Yeah, I think there's a reason why later writers renamed it to the Brotherhood instead of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants.
It's like, let's just label ourselves and put ourselves out there like that.
Yeah, but I want to remind you, though, that the Brotherhood at this point was being led by Mystique. This was her squad.
She has no subtlety whatsoever.
Oh, she still does here, but, I mean, she's a government agent, so she doesn't need subtlety anymore.
That's fair.
But on this squad of Freedom Force is Avalanche, Pyro, Blob, and the second Spider-Woman. I don't know how Spider-Woman ended up on this team. I mean, she's not a mutant. At least I don't believe she is.
Maybe she's their liaison?
That could be. That's actually a good suggestion. But Freedom Force and X-Factor came to blows quite a bit because, as you can imagine, X-Factor doesn't cotton to the Brotherhood regardless of who they're working for and their tactics. And in most of the first issue of the X-Factor leg of Mutant Massacre, the Brotherhood is after Rusty Collins and Skids Belvins. They're kind of two of the most notorious people that X-Factor ever rescued. Rusty is the one known as Fire Fist. Unlike the second Deadpool movie, he's a kind of a svelte white guy who creates fire blasts. How much more basic is it than that? Skids Belvins had a much more intriguing power. She had a force field she couldn't turn off, but it was a zero friction force field.
Meaning she's invulnerable, but
Friction.
Yeah,
Does that hold her?
In other words, it doesn't blunt force. Everything just slides right off it.
Oh, nice.
So she had a serious problem with control. 90% of the time, she could not turn this thing off no matter what she did. And that's why instead of having another force-related name, they called her Skids. Instead of running everywhere with a zero-friction force field, she tended to skate everywhere she was going. But
imagine
Sorry?
I was saying, I would imagine eating, doing some basic things would probably be difficult for her. Like eating.
It was a big challenge. Anyway, a lot of the team of X Factor was drawn into this because Artie Lang was a very young mutant they'd rescue at this point. His power was kind of insane. When his powers kicked in, his vocal cords stopped functioning. But in trade, he was able to psionically scan people and create these three-dimensional images above his head of what he was trying to convey.
Like Pictionary?
Yes, that's a good way to put it. Like psionic Pictionary. Except it's not localized to just the one person he's connected to. He can psionically read people, but he can project these images for everyone to see. This is how he spoke, in air quotes.
Interesting.
But he had the images as something weird was going on in the Morlock tunnels, and I don't know why, but X Factor seemed to have a direct connection to them, so he wandered himself into them. And this is the first time Artie came in contact with a Morlock who kind of famously became his best friend in various iterations of these characters' pairing. While he was walking through the tunnels and just kind of thinking to himself different images of things he was looking for, everything disappeared. And he ended up face to face with a young mutant named Leech.
Oh.
Leech is a living power dampener.
Mm-hmm.
And just like Skids, he has trouble turning off his abilities. They're on all the time. So anyone within a given radius of approximately 20 feet to him automatically has no powers. I'm kind of surprised that people haven't sought him out, because this kid seems like a weapon to me.
Yeah.
I think they try to do some of that in the third X-Men movie.
I think parts of his DNA were weaponized in comic books, and like put in tranq darts or something, or injectable darts, but I don't really recall.
I think you're right. I recall something of the sort.
But Leech takes Artie back to the Morlock tunnels because he figures that Artie is a lot like him. He's a mutant who has a very physical manifestation of his powers, therefore he'll fit in just fine with the rest of the Morlocks. And he introduces him to Caliban, who at this time is not the big hulking creature a lot of people recognize from cartoons or action figures. Caliban started out as very pale, very skinny, huge eyes, and his lone ability was the ability to sense other mutants. He called it his hound sense. And when I say sense, I didn't mean he could just feel that something was coming. He can pinpoint where he feels this mutant coming from. As a matter of fact, after the Mutant Massacre was done and Angel was thought to be dead, Caliban took his spot on the team. He had to wear a helmet while he was out in public so nobody recognized him, of course, but his powers can come in useful for an agency that specializes in rescuing mutants. Anyway, while Freedom Force chased Rusty and Skids back into the tunnels, Destiny was desperate to get Freedom Force out. She could see nothing but death in the tunnels. Her powers were telling her that people were going to die, and if Freedom Force stayed, they were going to, too. Before she could get that message fully across was when X Factor encountered Freedom Force, and mutants versus mutants, you know what you're getting. It's a rumble. But eventually Destiny got through to Mystique that they had to leave, and Freedom Force withdrew. Rusty, unfortunately, was badly beaten up by, I believe it was Blob. But it was Angel's job. Angel and Jean Grey had to take Rusty and Skids back to their headquarters, while the rest of them looked through the tunnels to try and understand what exactly was going on down there and where Artie had gone. So now we're back to the X-Men side of the Mutant Massacre. And this is where things start to get violent. The Marauders have found their way to the Morlock's home tunnel. And the Marauders at this point, I'm starting to understand why I have so much trouble remembering them, because a lot of them were not big deals outside of this storyline.
Yeah.
You have Scalp Hunter, who we've talked about. He has all these weird components on his body that he can use to make into lethal armaments. Vertigo, whose entire ability is what it sounds like. She disrupts your balance. Harpoon, he's a native Canadian man who carries a bunch of harpoons, it's true, but he can kind of imbue them with energy, turn them into energy lances.
Interesting take.
Arclight, who a version of which was seen in Deadpool. This one is super strong and has a serious amount of damage resistance. The added ability, though, is when she hits something, she creates these sonic shockwaves. Can be almost as destructive as the punch. Then there's Scrambler. His name is power, or his name pretty much implies what he does: power disruption. Anybody he touches, he can disrupt their powers for a given amount of time. And then last up is Riptide. Now, Riptide is probably the one whose name talks the least about what he can do. He can spin really fast.
Okay, I understand the logic there.
Yeah, me neither. Except Riptide is also known to carry shurikens and a lot of knives. You can sense why he does what he does. Yeah, the Marauders made a mess of the Morlocks. There is one rather large one known as Sunder. He also can take a serious amount of damage. His skin is extremely dense, and he's strong. As he's rushing forward, Riptide throws out a bunch of sharp spines, and they kept bouncing off him, but they were impaling other Morlocks. But before he got too close, Scrambler ran up and tapped him on the arm, took away his abilities, and suddenly several of these things were embedded in his chest.
Oops.
Nice.
And then Scalp Hunter shot him with a shotgun.
Just to be sure.
Yeah. But this appears to be the entire mission of the Marauders, is to do nothing but kill the Morlocks. And that even people that were running were being hit hard. Harpoon hit one in the chest with one of his energy lances, and it caused the person to break down like they were hit with a large amount of acid. Arclight's powers are collapsing tunnels and just burying people within them. They are just doing en masse slaughter. It's nothing short of horrible. Meanwhile, back at the Xavier Institute, Nightcrawler is still testing out his powers, trying to teleport above Wolverine and make him smile, but the strain nearly makes him pass out. He's definitely still getting over some severe injuries. The X-Men probably wouldn't have known anything was going on, except one large Morlock broke through their grounds from underneath and just said something very quickly about the Morlocks in the tunnels and death before he died on their grounds.
Ooh.
Yeah, and he is huge. He looks to be about 18 feet tall. Now, mind you, the X-Men at this time is an injured Nightcrawler, Shadowcat, Colossus, Storm, who is in the lead but doesn't have her powers at this point, Wolverine, and then there's another woman who recently came to the Institute to understand her abilities, but nobody will put her in the field. Her name is Betsy Braddock.
Oh, Betsy, okay.
Oh, okay.
This is way before Quanon or anything like that. I believe this would be... I want to say this wouldn't be long after she recently gained a pair of cybernetic eyes from Mojo. Are you familiar with that story?
No.
Okay, short version. Captain Britain, her brother, had several adventures, but he was having a crisis of faith. He didn't know if he was worthy of the mantle or if he even wanted to do it anymore. So, when he left, without asking, Betsy Braddock created her own costume and was using her telepathic powers to masquerade as Captain Britain. Whether this is an ego thing or if she wanted to help, I couldn't say. Because, mind you, Betsy Braddock's prior experience in any sort of field before her short stint as Captain Britain was as a model.
Jeez.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she ran into somebody called the Slaymaster. Now, the Slaymaster doesn't have many abilities of his own, but he's credited as a world-class assassin. He normally takes people on hand-to-hand. Doesn't often carry weapons. When he ran into Betsy in a Captain Britain outfit, he figured this had to be a joke. His worst enemy was insulting him somehow with this decoy. So he was going to draw Captain Britain out. He managed to beat Betsy near senseless, took his fingers, and jabbed him into her eye sockets.
Ooh.
He removed her eyes.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Gross.
Yeah, and he let Betsy go because, again, this was his message to Captain Britain. Well, Brian Braddock got that message, and you wouldn't believe the voicemail he left.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, Slaymaster was beaten within a literal inch of his life. I don't know what stopped him from killing him, but Brian's always been... I don't want to say proud about it, but he's always mentioned that he's been pushed close to his edges, and the Slaymaster's the only one that's ever done it.
So is that like a Batman thing where I'm not going to kill anyone?
Well, no. Captain Britain has never really tried to kill anyone. It's just not his thing. He is egotistical because of the amount of power he has, and I guess for a human to have that much power, it'd be kind of hard not to be. But he has always been very stalwart about his purpose. He is to defend Britain. But, yeah, Betsy was wandering around, not blindly. She was using her telepathy and seeing through other people's eyes so she could get full pictures of the places she was. But she still had empty eye sockets. Then she was kidnapped by Mojo in the Mojoverse, who was still looking for entertainment in all things.
Right.
And when he kidnapped her, I believe this is also the point where he kidnapped the X-Men and then decided they were too volatile as adults to deal with, so he de-aged them.
Oh, I remember some... Yeah.
He turned them into the first known X-Babies.
Yeah.
And this caused the New Mutants, who were still technically students at this time, to steal the costumes that were intended for their graduation and rush in to save them. At the same time they were saving them, they also found this odd telepathic woman who had a newly implanted set of eyes in her head. She knew they came from Mojo for some strange reason, and she was desperate to remove them, but she could see. So what can you do, right? She's not going to reach in and pluck them out with her own fingers. That's insane.
Yeah.
So she stayed with them. What she didn't know is that those two eyes that Mojo gave her were cameras.
Of course.
Oh.
He was using them to watch the X-Men the entire time. So this is one of the reasons why Mojo hadn't made a whole lot of incursions into their universe for a while, because he had free TV to broadcast.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry, that was a big aside, but I felt like that required an explanation.
No, that definitely clears up a lot.
All right.
Thank you.
So anyway, getting back to it, the X-Men suit up, and thanks to Magic's teleportational abilities, they're dropped off in the tunnels. And they're dropped off into a charnel house. There are bodies everywhere, there's devastation, there is no explanation. And before they can really ruminate about what they're going to do next, that's when Vertigo hit them. At the same time, Riptide did.
Ooh.
Now, thankfully, Colossus and Rogue stood in front of most of the X-Men. And what few they couldn't deflect, Wolverine had no problem just not letting it hit him. Unfortunately, Nightcrawler decided to take the lead and teleport to kick Riptide, and then teleported again to grab Vertigo. Then he did one of his multi-teleportational...
Where he kind of jumps from one place to the other without completely leaving the one place first?
No, he was jumping from point to point. What he's known to do is to grab people and then disorient them by rapid jumps.
Mm-hmm.
Or rapid teleportations, which he did, but remember, recently severely injured.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, he was drained. Unfortunately, Riptide was still on his feet.
Uh-oh.
And then Riptide did a high-speed spin at point-blank range.
Ooh.
Yeah, still carrying sharp objects. Nightcrawler was severely injured. He's not seen again for the rest of this event. Meanwhile, so while Magic has to teleport away with what few survivors there are, and Nightcrawler to try and get medical help.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, Scalp Hunter actually murders Leech's foster mother, Anna Lee, in a different room. Colossus and Shadowcat hear the shot. And Colossus is slowly starting to lose his stuff. You know how he's strong, he can take a severe amount of punishment, but he's more or less a pacifist. He does not want to hurt people unless absolutely necessary. But as this event goes on and more bodies are found, Colossus is getting more and more overt about his tactics. When they hear the shotgun blast, he doesn't spend time trying to find their way into an upper tunnel. He rips out the ceiling of the one they're in so they can get higher. You know, he's throwing large chunks of debris at people, and I don't think he understands how much damage they can take. He just wants all this to stop. He ends up in a fist fight with Arclight, which is a good back and forth, and almost like I'm starting to understand why Deadpool was written the way it was. Meanwhile, Scalp Hunter puts a gun at the temple of a young Kitty Pryde, and pulls it. He did not know she could phase.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm just glad she did.
Yeah, he tries a sword and it's still not happening. Unfortunately, she realizes that Arclight is back and Colossus is under a large debris field.
Uh-oh.
So she postures really strong, but she dives into the debris to find him. Meanwhile, while the rest of the X-Men are starting to lead some other Morlock survivors, including Callisto, out of the tunnels, Rogue has to push Storm's head down because it's nearly taken off by a red beam. And Wolverine says that looks like Cyclops' optic blast. What's going on? But they're not entirely sure, because before they can really follow Wolverine's nose down the tunnel, the one in front of them explodes outward. It's Colossus doing shortcuts again. They have a few survivors, but unfortunately they don't have much to say other than they're having trouble locking all this down. The X-Men get into another fight with the combined Marauders. Scrambler and Rogue touch each other, which kind of shorts out both of their powers. Harpoon tries one of his energy harpoons to Colossus' chest, which burns but doesn't put him down. But while Rogue is still having trouble with Scrambler's abilities, Harpoon moves past Colossus and throws one of his energy harpoons at Rogue's back.
Ew.
It does not connect because Shadowcat jumps in the way.
Aww.
She grabs Rogue and attempts to phase, but the energy harpoon seems to disperse at the back of her form. Hurts Shadowcat badly, but it hurts her in a different way. She can't unphase.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Meanwhile, this is where things start to get dark, because Riptide is just enjoying himself way too much. He's throwing all this stuff at Colossus that embeds itself in him, but doesn't seem to be stopping him. And I think he's just entertaining a target that won't fall down immediately. And in the middle of his anger, Colossus reaches out into Riptide's form, grabs him by the neck, and squeezes.
Pop.
Yes. Riptide is down. And because of what Harpoon did to Shadowcat, guess what he wants to do now? But by the time he's done killing Riptide, the other Marauders have already GTFO'd. So the X-Men have to lick their wounds and take the survivors back while they can. There's too many civilians to worry about right now. And they still have to worry about what to do about Shadowcat. She cannot become physical at this point.
Was it just a temporary short out, or what?
Well, if you don't mind me skipping ahead, it is not. Because of the injuries Nightcrawler and Shadowcat sustained, they were both sent to Muir Isle. And while they're gone, everybody thought the X-Men died at a subsequent event called the Fall of the Mutants. It was a very public thing where the X-Men were turned into an energy spell by Forge, who is not just a mutant, he's also a shamanic mystic, right? And he threw them at this chaos entity known as the Adversary. What nobody knew was that the goddess of Otherworld, the daughter of Merlin, Roma, she actually had something of an affinity for the X-Men. So she reconstituted them after they were used in the spell, but gave them an added ability, just this mystic kind of thing that was never really undone. It just kind of went away, where they could not be recorded on any electronic devices.
Huh.
So if anyone snaps
random.
if anyone snaps a picture of them or takes a video of them, it just appears as this blurry, unidentifiable image.
So she must have given those abilities to Sasquatch and Nessie and all the others, yes?
No, Sasquatch is a Canadian hero in Alpha Flight.
I meant the actual creature Sasquatch, the lack of
I don't know.
clarity in photos.
Well, it was during an extended period the X-Men went underground. By the time Shadowcat and Nightcrawler were well enough to do anything, but were still having individual issues, very much born from this. Nightcrawler still couldn't multi-teleport at all without serious strain, and Shadowcat had to concentrate just to stay physical long enough to grab things and eat. It was at this time where they were convalesced at that point that they started a new superhero team with Captain Britain, Megan the Fae, who nobody knew was a Fae at this point, and a suddenly reappearing Rachel Summers, and became the first Excalibur.
Okay.
So basically, Nightcrawler and Shadowcat, once they're down and out from Mutant Massacre, they're down and out from the X-Men for a serious amount of time. Going back to X-Factor, the Mutant Massacre is continuing. Jean and Angel are still taking Rusty and Skids back to their headquarters, while Cyclops, Beast, and Iceman are doing their best to deal with the Marauders. And during part of this is when Cyclops takes a long blast but misses Harpoon and it flies down the hall. You can guess what this harkens back to.
Yeah.
But try as they might, they cannot lock down the Marauders in any way. Unfortunately, Caliban runs afoul of the unknown Marauder who just showed up in this issue. Sabretooth.
Oh, fun.
Yeah. Sabretooth takes a good swipe at him, but he is knocked back by Cyclops. And while they're deciding what to do about it, Sabretooth, unfortunately... Well, they didn't see anyone else in the tunnel when Cyclops blasted him. Artie and Leech had ducked down a pipe, and Caliban was around a corner. and they didn't have time to figure it out because there was screaming coming from another direction. Why nobody wrote that somebody did something about Sabretooth, I don't know. Maybe it's because at this point he's still a relative unknown entity to the X-Men. But either way, before Sabretooth comes to, Leech and Artie drag Caliban down a storm pipe, something too thin for Sabretooth to fit down. This whole thing seems kind of desperate, I know. But it's a desperate situation.
Yeah.
Fast forwarding, after a long back and forth, and several X-Men are attempting really hard to keep things together. Not X-Men, I should say X-Factor. Another fatality happened among the Marauders. This one was a relatively unknown one named Prism. The ability to redirect or catch energy in his crystalline-like body, redirect it into either laser-style blasts, force blasts, or large flashes to disorient.
Mm-hmm.
Now that Jean Grey and Angel are back in the tunnel, they see Prism starting to get the better of Cyclops. Jean Grey grabs him telekinetically and smashes him into a wall head first.
Ooh, ow.
Stop that.
Shattered him.
Oh, wow.
Imagine.
Yes. I mean, I don't think that was purposeful. I think she reacted on instinct and just kind of overdid it. Because this period of X-Factor is not long after Jean Grey returned, and her powers at this point start to grow on an exponential basis. You gotta remember, this is a Jean Grey who supposedly was not the Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
She was, her original Phoenix form was the Phoenix masquerading as her while it put her in stasis. So the upper levels of her powers are still relatively unknown, even to her at this point. She's able to pick people up individually. She's able to hold certain debris walls at field. This is not like the woman who can, telekinetically lift 20 people like she can later in life. So I think she's still discovering what her upper levels could be.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where it gets bad, because Cyclops and Beast were hurt kind of badly in that last fight. Jean Grey's the only one who has the power to lift the two of them out of there because they have no super strong people left. And Iceman is her cover. So that leaves just one person still looking for Artie. Angel. Warren.
Mm-hmm.
And he manages to find Artie, but he finds him at the same time that Vertigo, Blockbuster, and Harpoon do. And Warren has already screwed up earlier in this issue. He was comforting Jean Grey while Candy Southern, his current girlfriend, saw him, and she called him a cheat, which he wasn't technically, but Warren has more feelings for Jean than he does Candy, and he feels bad for it.
Mm-hmm.
He also feels bad that even though Jean Grey and Cyclops are not an item at this point, he is kind of wedging himself in the middle of what they could be. And believe me, Sorry?
He was third wheeling?
He was kind of third wheeling, although it's one of those things where it's a yes and a no. Yes, he's wedging himself in the middle of what their relationship could be if they reconcile. However, this is also, a Scott Summers who was so confused by Jean Grey's return, he walked out on his current wife and their son.
Mm.
So, I mean, there is no Angel in this group here. Literally or figuratively. They're all very confused. But Angel feels bad because he had a choice, and instead of choosing the woman who currently loves him, he chose the one, or he tried to choose the one that he's pining for. So he willingly tried to find Artie on his own, even though he knew it could cause serious damage. And when the Marauders came across him and Artie, he sent Artie to run up the tunnel while he held them at bay. And mind you, this is Vertigo, Blockbuster, and Harpoon versus the guy with the wings.
Yeah.
So they made short work of him. Blockbuster held him up to a wall, was ripping out pin feathers, and meanwhile Harpoon just said, hold him there, and threw harpoons into the elbow joints of his wings.
Ow.
And they were prepared to kill him at this moment. Now, there's another issue here that primarily has to do with the New Mutants, who were tired of being left on the sidelines. The X-Men are bringing out Morlocks en masse to be taken care of. Even Psylocke or Betsy Braddock appears to be more help than they are, and they've been here for a while. So, after a bit of a tantrum, the New Mutants do what the New Mutants do. Fine, they won't let us do it, we'll do it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And they wander into the tunnels. And this
Sounds like a bad idea there.
This is what the New Mutants do, though. They're constantly overlooked, and sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. But in this case, they're still very young. It's still very much the original crew. It's Doug Ramsey pre-death, it's Mirage, it's Sunspot, it's Cannonball, Wolfsbane, Magma, and Magic, and Warlock.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't know how, but while they're down in the tunnels looking for whatever's going on, they manage to run into the Magus. Warlock's father.
Oh,
Yeah. Now we're bouncing into a character that has almost nothing to do with anything that's happened before. Thor!
how's he involved?
Well, he just returned to Earth. He pretty much told his father that he wanted nothing to do with Asgard, and his powers have always felt kind of off. He returned to Midgard, and I don't know, he felt this weird weakness. So he transformed into one of his human guises, Sigurd Jorgensen, I believe it was.
Oh, okay.
And, not before he managed to stop a guy who was trying to rob another man in Central Park. And it's kind of funny because the guy is just threatening this other guy with a gun. He's already got his wallet. Then he notices this large hammer being held under his nose, and he was smart enough to drop everything right there. I won't get into the Asgardian aspects of the story because they're really not important to what we're discussing.
Mm-hmm.
But, Thor is reconnecting with an old friend of his human guys, and I guess they seem to know that he is Thor in real life because he has no problem transforming in front of him. He even talks to a friend of his, which is mentioning an odd slaughter in the tunnels, and this friend is a frog named Puddle Gulp, who, if I remember correctly, is the one that eventually gets a splinter of the Mjolnir hammer and transforms into Throg, God of Thunder. No, Frog of Thunder.
Frog of Thunder.
But apparently he still speaks frog because of the time Loki transformed Thor himself into a frog. The original Throg. But Thor transforms, and when he runs into the tunnel, he appears to have arrived not long after Angel was impaled on the wall, because the Marauders have not had a chance to kill him. So, 3 Marauders versus Thor. What do you think their odds are? So did they.
10-1?
Yeah, so did they. They took off. They tried in the early on, but when he threw them off and suddenly created a small thunderbolt in the middle of the place, they said, nope, we're done.
Nope.
And
Worth it.
yeah, he recognizes Angel, but not the costume he's in. And he still, pulls the harpoons out, and he wants to both get Angel to safety and find the people that did this to him, as well as whoever is leaving bodies everywhere. So this is where things get even more complicated. Power Pack.
Do
you know what Power Pack is?
Vaguely.
Okay.
Only vaguely, yeah.
Power Pack, depending on the area you're talking about, is 4 or 5 siblings of the Power family. And no, I don't know all their names intrinsically. And they have a set of abilities. Light projection that can cause them to fly, the ability to change their density into like mist-like forms, gravity control, and an ability to project like deadly energy blasts. As well as a younger brother who eventually developed this weird dream self ability. He can see people's dreams and project them, or he can enter them.
Creepy.
And when I say it gets more complicated than that, the powers of the other 4, because of a couple of adventures, they kept switching between people. So they've all had, it seems like most of their abilities at one point or another. But long story short, the youngest one gets a dream projection from Leech that he is in desperate trouble. And they know Leech. They've been to the Morlock tunnels. Power Pack actually knows a few Marvel heroes, including Wolverine. I hope he never babysat.
Yeah, that'd be awkward.
Well, you think that's awkward? Do you want to know who Power Pack ran into in the tunnels?
Sure.
Sabretooth.
Oh, wonderful.
Actually ran into a group of toddlers he couldn't kill, and he was rather irritated with the whole thing. And Power Pack thinks they're giving Leech the distraction that he needs to get away, and as they're running around a corner from Sabretooth, they run into someone else who's very short, hairy, with claws, and looking for somebody.
Hey, they're buddy.
Yeah. But instead of actually watching these kids or trying to get them anywhere, he runs past them so he can get a piece of Sabretooth. To which Power Pack is just like, okay, see ya. But Power Pack themselves do manage to find Artie and Leech, but they're suddenly discovered by Harpoon, Arclight, and Scrambler, who again seem woefully unprepared for a group of superpowered kids. I wouldn't say they managed to kill them, but they managed to outdo them in certain ways. The one currently with gravity powers, he came up with a bright idea to focus 4 times gravity around his hand and hit Arclight in the face.
Oof.
Knocked her out, too. But thankfully, before things get worse, the rest of X Factor shows up. And they agree to take Artie and Leech back to their headquarters so they can at least be safe. And Power Pack is told to please go home.
This is not a place for you. Please go away.
Yeah, thankfully these kids listen relatively well. So now we're back to Thor, who again has rescued Angel and has managed to pull the harpoons out of his wings. And he wants to find him some help. He's carrying him through the tunnels. But before he gets terribly far, he manages to apparently come across Artie, who's by himself at this point. I guess X-Factor found Leech, but not Artie. And while he's trying to walk the two of them out of the tunnels, Blockbuster comes down from the ceiling, lands on Thor's arm, and breaks it.
Wow.
Yeah. And mind you, Thor's hammer is still on his belt. And nothing about this should still be possible.
No.
And give Warren Worthington credit. At this point, maybe he's able to do nothing but fly, but he's awake enough to know that Thor's in trouble and jumps on Blockbuster's back. To which he's getting choked for his trouble, and Blockbuster probably would have finished off Angel, except hammer to the face. Except, Thor's arm is still broken. It's not healing. Now he has to carry Angel one-handed and lead Artie out of there. And believe it or not, Artie manages to find Jean Grey and Cyclops in the tunnel. To which Thor obviously hands over Angel because he doesn't know what to do, and his arm is still frickin' broken. But before Jean Grey telekinetically carries Angel the rest of the way out of the tunnel, Cyclops blasted a ladder so they could get a section of it and a part of Thor's cape so they could make him an improvised splint. It's at this point...
I would like to know who has the strength to set his bones back.
I don't know, but here's the thing. We found out why his arms are breaking.
Okay.
Hela's punishing him.
Okay.
He may have chosen to be in Midgard, but basically, the summation is, she's punishing him by giving him a weakness while he's there. She has created an enchantment over Earth that as long as he's there, his bones are as breakable as any mortals, and they will not heal like a god's.
Ow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody holds a grudge.
Yeah, but in the midst of it all, because there's still bodies everywhere, and Hela is just kind of reveling both in her curse of Thor and how much death is in the tunnel right now, Thor has basically decided he's going to exorcise all spirits in the tunnel by giving a Viking funeral. No, he's very literal about this. He used his powers to create thunder and lightning, enough to set the bodies in the tunnel ablaze.
Whoa.
He created a firestorm to cleanse the tunnels of death.
That's one way to do it. Sheesh.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is the end of Thor's involvement in the massacre. Meanwhile, Wolverine is still finding bodies that have been slashed at. And Betsy Braddock has been given Cerebro so that she can keep in contact with Wolverine while the rest of the X-Men are still tending to very injured Morlocks. You can see how wide scope this is.
Yeah.
Colossus needs a little bit of help himself because his injuries won't allow him to change back to human. Remember, he had to pluck a lot of Riptide spines out of himself, as well as a certain level of exhaustion. He was actually exhausted to the point where he fell over on top of Betsy Braddock.
Oh.
She had to send out psychic calls to help for Rogue because they needed somebody strong enough to lift this off of her.
I'm stuck. Help. Help.
Yeah. And so Magneto used his powers to scan the metal in Colossus's body and try to repair the wounds enough so that he's at least okay, or at least transform back. Except Colossus can't move.
Oh boy.
He's a master of magnetism, not a surgeon.
And?
Okay, Colossus was eventually okay. It just took a while for his body to heal like that. Meanwhile, Wolverine found what he was looking for.
Rematch.
Yep. And Storm is having a crisis of faith. She has no powers, but she's X-Men leader, and she appears to have led her people into a slaughter. You know, several of them really injured, 2 of them possibly mortally, for all she knows. And, oh, by the way, Sabretooth has an extra incentive to make Wolverine fight and not run.
Oh.
He hasn't killed the Morlock healer yet.
Oh.
Somebody who the X-Men could desperately use the help of?
Yeah.
But, you think that's going to stop Wolverine from picking a fight?
Nope.
No.
No, it doesn't. Storm, long story short, gets over a crisis of conscience. Wow, I really screwed that up. And Wolverine managed to actually fight his own instincts. He fought Sabretooth further down the tunnel away from the healer. Then he slashed a few of the support beams in the tunnel and collapsed it between them. because he's not an animal. By the time Sabretooth dug himself out of there, he had enough time to get the healer out so that healer could both convalesce a bit as well as help his people. Although Wolverine just barely made it out of the tunnels before there was a sudden blast of heat behind him that he has no idea what the frick that's about. But we know what that's about as readers. That's Thor. That's the Viking funeral.
Going boom.
Yeah. There's a little bit more about X-Factor trying to help out 4 more radicalized mutants who made it out of the tunnels, but unfortunately they could not assimilate to life on the surface world, as they put it. It's one of those tragedies where it was a combination of a misunderstanding and people just not being used to mutants.
Right.
I won't bore you with the details because we've been here a little bit already. It's been almost an hour. But these people did not survive. However, we did see a young thief who's working for the Vanisher who did not like him trying to take as much of a cut as he does. So in the purse he demanded from behind her back. She left a little gift in it that exploded. This is the first time I'm aware that I've seen Tabitha Smith, a.k.a. Boom Boom.
Right.
Yeah.
That name.
And then the next person to run across everything is Daredevil. Sabretooth has dug his way out of the debris Wolverine left him in, and he's still killing Morlocks in the tunnel. Daredevil actually managed to follow somebody coming out of the tunnels and run his way in. Now, this is kind of amazing because I didn't think of this as Daredevil's kind of purview. The reason why people are going in the tunnels is because they've heard all the mutants in there are dead, but there's all these facilities that they built that's left behind, so people are starting to stake out claims in the tunnels of their territory. And believe it or not, Sabretooth had pretty much finished killing. He was sleeping his fatigue away. He was awoken when some of the teenage gangsters down in the tunnels who were arguing over who owned what started to yell at each other, and that woke him up.
Of course, because he's grumpy.
Yes, he is.
Cat.
And they're on his lawn.
Yeah, and of course, this is about the point Daredevil goes jumping in, going, "What in the frick? What are you?" So the two of them fight for a little bit, and Sabretooth, I don't want to say gets the better of him, but he's just kind of outclassing Daredevil in all the ways you'd think he would. Stronger, faster, but probably not smarter. He has, however, tied up a woman onto the side that he's been deciding what to do with, and to give himself some space when Daredevil starts to outclass him, he slashes at her throat.
Oh.
This is where things get a little bit weird, because Sabretooth started to complain about how the hunger to kill just makes him hungrier, and he runs away howling like an animal. And then when Daredevil checks on the woman, yes, she's been slashed, but apparently it wasn't terribly deep. Like he was just playing with her, or didn't know what to do with her. It's like somebody tried to make depth to Sabretooth at this moment that really wasn't there. Like he was a cat toying with something. It doesn't make a terrible amount of sense, in my opinion, narratively. There's one more issue in the middle of the convalescence of the Morlocks, who are now, I guess you can say, in hospice care in the Xavier Institute. It's also like one of the first times Dazzler's been in the X-Men since the Dark Phoenix saga. She's being attacked by this psionic entity named Malice. It's entirely a mind that's disembodied, and it tries to get in contact with different people, take them over, and become them.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, Sabretooth isn't done hunting. He's followed the Morlocks all the way to the Xavier Institute, and he manages to smash Rogue in the face and knock her out. But then he wanders into the Cerebro room, and he finds no one but Betsy Braddock in there, who, I mind you, is still convalescing herself, not an X-Man, but somehow manages to lead Sabretooth on a cat-and-mouse chase through the Institute. She actually threw a barbell at him. Which
at his head, I hope?
Yeah.
Or his toes?
He caught it, crumpled it, threw it back. Caused her to fall out of a window on the second story, but she kept fighting. She actually managed to make it into Storm's attic room, grabbed a sword, or grabbed some kind of African blade off the wall, and was ready to defend herself. Unfortunately, they were interrupted when a small Canadian hairy man also followed Sabretooth to this place. And while Sabretooth is laughing at Wolverine about what he's going to do, he's suddenly hit in the face with a staff. Storm wanted to find out who's messing with her room. So, yeah, between the three of them, Wolverine manages to fight Sabretooth outside, while Magneto is busy taking the mangled metal furniture in Storm's room and making manacles out of them, because apparently he has a plan. And Wolverine was fighting Sabretooth to a standstill, and this is where Psylocke really kind of differentiated herself. Because while they were doing it, Magneto showed her how to concentrate. And while Sabretooth was fighting Wolverine, Betsy was quietly probing his mind to find out that the Marauders and Sabretooth had a master. And she got information on where to start looking for him before Wolverine and Sabretooth fought their way off a cliff. By this time, Rogue was awake again, dove down to find them, but she could only find Wolverine under the water, who's demanding that she let him go so he can look for Sabretooth.
Yeah, they'll be fine.
Yeah, but because of Betsy's grace under fire, this is when she and the X-Men decided that she is a member of the team now.
I mean, you would think.
Yeah, but this wasn't the best period for her. After this, yes, she's an X-Man, but remember, she's an X-Man with no real physical training. So while she's a powerful telepath, she ends up in the background of a lot of the stuff they do. It wasn't until I want to say the fall of the mutant. No, I don't remember when exactly she picked it up, but it wasn't until that she changed her outfit from this pink one-piece thing that was very pretty but frilly into this purple and puce armor that at least allowed her to stand closer to the front lines. And then she was seriously upgraded, as you know, when her mind was mixed with Quanon's and they became kind of the same entity in two different bodies.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So that is the Mutant Massacre, and I gotta admit, it's not as engrossing as I hoped it would be as a story. It's a lot of very 80s style storytelling and art.
But very complicated.
It's very complicated, and it is finally nice to know what happened to Shadowcat and Nightcrawler that took them out of the X-Men for a period. You know, and it was after this also that they had another adventure where they started to help Dazzler with her malice problem. This is where Dazzler started to enter the X-Men's actual world instead of just being something they encountered every now and again.
Right.
You know, and that really doesn't require a lot of explanation. It's an X-Men story. What can you say? So do you feel like you learned something?
Yeah, wow, a lot.
There's quite a bit to unpack there, and I can actually give you one more spoiler. It's well known that Sinister hired the Marauders to kill the Morlocks. It was not known until like the late 90s why in the world he was so adamant that this group of mutants, who apparently weren't that important, be killed. This was retconned later to explain it all. Do you guys know who the Dark Beast is?
No.
Okay. Flash forward to the late 90s. The Age of Apocalypse happens. The world has changed so that Xavier died early on. No one led the X-Men. Magneto tried his best to follow his best friend's dream, but Magneto is not Xavier. Apocalypse ended up running the world, and a lot of the characters you know as X-Men ended up under his thrall. Cyclops, Havoc, Cannonball, Henry McCoy. The Henry McCoy from that universe somehow managed to survive the collapse of it and the restoration of the regular timeline. What I did not know was that he wasn't reinserted into Marvel in the 90s. He appeared probably back in the 70s.
Really? That early?
Yes, but the Beast from the Age of Apocalypse was under the tutelage of Sinister. He was learning genetic manipulation from the man. And this Beast was psychopathic. He was willing to experiment on anybody and anything just to satisfy his own weird curiosities. Think of it like Mr. Sinister in Henry McCoy's body, is more or less what you get in the Dark Beast.
Interesting.
So, the Dark Beast started to experiment on mutants because back in the 70s, what was there? A lot of inexperienced X-Men, or maybe the first 5 still running around? And all of his experiments resulted in the Morlocks. Now, the reason why...
So their science experiments gone wrong?
Not gone wrong, just left. You know, they're the toys that the Dark Beast created and then just abandoned when he was done with them. Now, here's why Sinister is involved. Because Sinister, in a retcon, discovered that the Morlocks had a lot of his genetic manipulation techniques and he had no idea why. But he didn't want that to exist. That was an affront to his art.
Huh. Gotcha.
So the Mutant Massacre was just Sinister cleaning up things that could lead back to him that he had no responsibility for or interest in. He was just cleaning the slate, or clearing the board, as it were. at least there's a purpose to all this beyond just injure people. Maybe back in the time it was written, it was meant to shake things up and take out a few members of the X-Men that there were just no stories for. But it's nice that somebody found a purpose for it all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a cornerstone of X-Men history. It changed a lot within a few issues. You have the injury of Angel, who eventually turns into Death. You have the injuries to Nightcrawler and Shadowcat, which take them completely out of the X-Men's lineup for a little while, as well as a chance for Psylocke to really differentiate herself and show that she can be someone who can handle herself. And then there's the New Mutants being stupid again. I swear, that must be in the yearbook.
It's like, oh, time to be stupid. It's been 15, 20 years.
Is it 8 o'clock already? All right. We had a little bit of a discussion as to what to do about next week at the end of the last show, and we kind of settled on the next character we'd like to take a deep look at. Bishop.
Yes.
An X-Man with a history that starts in the 90s, but technically reaches so much further than that, as well as being the grandson of an X-Men associate, and that gets kind of complicated.
Huh.
I know, it's all there. It's especially kind of timely considering Bishop is now a Red Bishop in the Hellfire Club.
Really?
Yeah, I wouldn't say Shadowcat convinced him to take the job, but she and Magneto kind of kept annoying him until he just fell into it. He kept saying no. Wait, where are we going? Damn it. That's kind of how he found the job. But yeah, next week we will discuss Bishop. So thank you for showing up. I hope you've learned something today. I look forward to the discussion next week. I am Jeremy.
I'm Joanna.
And I am Jesse.
And you have just been expertly informed.